So we are in Jonah, Jonah's Dilemma. We're trying to undo the vegetable perspective of Jonah. And again, if you have kids or you've been in and around kids, you know there's these Veggie Tales, and Jonah is one of them. Jonah who ends up running from God, but ends up in Nineveh to handle, in the Veggie Tale versions, the fish slappers that are there, and they slap each other with fish. And unfortunately, if you were with us last week, you would learn that that's not quite what the Ninevites would do. It was a little worse than that. But essentially, Jonah is about a person who really has become hypocritical and hateful towards other people. And that's important to keep in mind, because as we go through and we learn about Jonah a little bit, we're going to see that his descent into this darkness is something that we can pay attention to and I think learn something from. It's really it's an interesting story, and like I said, as we kind of got into this a bit, it seems just completely over the top. The book of Jonah does, and it is like that on purpose. It's built on purpose to be over the top. It's almost like it's got a little comedy in it. It's got a little tragedy in it. You could take this and turn it into a cartoon. Objects within this are always big and huge and enormous, and everything, again, is just over the top. The characters in the book of Jonah are all reversed. The prophet of God, does anybody remember his name? Dove, son of faithfulness. That's what Jonah, son of Amittai, means. Okay? Dove, the gentle, peaceful bringing object, son of faithfulness. You would think that he would be the one that would be faithful to God and all that he does, but it turns out he's the opposite. And then the pagans that we're going to meet all through the book of Jonah turn out to be the ones that are faithful and have a heart for God. So everything in this book is turned upside down and kind of sideways with it. But at the end of the day, this story is really about, and I tried to find the right word here, but it's really about apathy. It's really about looking at our life and looking at our relationship with our Creator and looking at the things that we do to take that relationship for granted. And how easy it is to just simply begin to move away from God, just kind of step away from Him a little bit. And it turns out to be really hundreds or perhaps thousands of little decisions that we make, just tiny decisions we make every day throughout our lives, that eventually bring us to a point where we ask the question, how did I get into this problem I'm in? And it's a conscious descent. I mean, we know, I'm trusting that you know when you are running from God. You have no doubt when you know the right thing to do, the thing you should do, what God has asked you to do, and you're moving in the opposite direction. You know when you're doing that. You're fully conscious of it, typically. I think sometimes there are decisions, I'm not necessarily talking about, do I choose the Campbell's soup or the off-brand soup? They're both soup, they're going to feed you. It's not decisions like that in our days. It's when we actively know that we shouldn't be doing something, but we're absolutely going to do it anyway. And perhaps you've had this kind of conversation of, God, I know, could you leave me alone for a little while so I could just go do this thing that I want to go do? Quit bugging me, conscience. Just go away. Now, maybe I'm the only one that's ever gone through that, but I think that we have done those kind of things before. And when that happens, I think what happens is that for us, life, kind of just comes in and it begins to really just have an impact in our world. And I like the term of it just kind of sails in. Life just sort of ports into our world a little bit. And when it starts to get a little tough and these decisions get hard, we just bail out. But what we don't realize until we've made these thousands of decisions that led to this moment is that we have been swallowed up in these decisions. And then we find ourselves in a spot where we can't get ourselves out. And that's really what the story of Jonah is about. It's about somebody who's making these kind of decisions. And I just want to warn you really quickly. Jonah is full of traps. Okay? The author has set bait, pun intended, for you all through this fish story. Because the goal is to get you to see yourself. It's to get us to see ourselves in the story. And so if you're ready, let's give it a shot and see. Let's see if we can find ourselves in this particular story. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, again dove, son of faithfulness, saying, "Arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. We covered this last week. Why is Jonah running? Because he's afraid of the Ninevites? Because he's running from the Lord because he hates Ninevites. We saw that last week. He hates the Assyrians for what they've done to him and to his people. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. And here we go again, the God of the Old Testament throwing lightning bolts out at people to try to get them, right? Throws this great wind upon the sea, and everyone is freaking out with it. And we could think that, but that isn't the God of the Old Testament. That's not what he's doing. You see, he's on a mission to reach some people. And he's got someone he's selected to do that who's in rebellion, active rebellion and disobedience to that. And so in his mercy to try to bring a word, bring a message to the people of Nineveh, and to try to bring a message to Jonah, his approach can seem, could we say, severe. They're out on the open water, and they're dealing with a storm that is absolutely insane. And this is where I wish we could all have a little insight into the original language. Because when it says the ship threatened to break it up, the way it's written in there is almost as if the ship, is pondering. It's got a mind of its own. It's trying to decide, do I stay together or do I break up? It's very over the top. This ship even plays a little role in the characterization of this. And one of the things that's happened is these sailors, remember, these are mariners who are moving cargo all the time from the port of Joppa out to Tarshish. Now, that distance, by the way, is about 2,600 miles. It's nearly the same distance as it is from New York to Los Angeles. It's just about 600 miles shorter than what you would do sailing across the Atlantic. That's the distance they're traveling. So they know these waters. They're very experienced sailors. And when this storm comes up, when the Lord hurls or throws this storm at them, this great wind, they immediately get the sense in their mind, this is not normal. There's something divine about this storm. There's something strange. And so they begin to think to themselves, that's why you see they cry out to their own gods, and that's the way it worked in this system. You had your own personal gods, you had family gods, you had city gods, you had boat gods, you had water gods, you had merchandise gods, you had all kinds of gods. And so essentially you pull out the reference sheet and you start going down the list of all of the different gods, because maybe you'll get one, maybe you'll hit one that will ease this storm up a little bit, right? You might just get there. But I want to kind of notice something that they're all in prayer. They're crying out. And they're throwing their merchandise over the side of the ship. And if you're a Bible study nerd, merchants who were throwing their cargo into the sea is really an odd picture, because we know that in the structure of Babylon, merchants are the ones who are trading in the misery and evil of others. And so the picture of these pagans they're calling out to their gods. They're willing to destroy their own livelihood to try to survive this storm. So they keep pitching everything over the side. And what's happened to Jonah? Dove, son of faithfulness. Where is Jonah here? Let's see. But Jonah, he had gone down into the inner parts of the ship and laid down and was fast asleep. So our prophet of God, Dove, son of faithfulness, is sleeping away down in the inner sanctum of the boat, while our sailors are up above. They're fully awake. They're fully aware. They are taking whatever action that they can to save themselves. And here's our prophet, Dove, son of faithfulness. And the author here has done something really brilliant that we just miss. Some English translations don't catch the language. They try to change the language to make it easier to read. But when you really look at this closely, it becomes a picture, this whole entry scene, a picture of what happens to us, what happens to Jonah, and what can happen to us as we continue our rebellion, as we continue our sinful disobedience, moving further and further away from God. The author starts to paint a picture for us, and it's pretty interesting, because here's what happens. When Jonah starts out on his journey, he goes down to Joppa, and Israel was just a little north. The kingdom of Israel was just a little north of the port of Joppa. So he would be, in theory, going down to Joppa. And the next thing that we find Jonah doing is he pays his fee and he goes down into the ship at the port of Joppa. So he goes down. And the next thing that we see is he goes down into the depths of the ship, which is where he lays down and goes into a deep sleep. He goes down, 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 down. The further he moves away, the further he goes down and descends and descends and descends into exile, just this conscious decision-making, until he's in such a slumber, he's completely unaware of everything that's happening around him. He's continuing to move down. It's this willful, sinful disobedience that's moving him in this direction down. Now, even in our culture today, we know that, spiritually speaking, down is not where you want to go. We still talk about up there, down there, right? And it's the same. And Jonah, through his decisions, these little decisions that are stacking up, has entered this numb, just maybe even depressed, deadened, unaware state of what's going on around him. And the author is just, I'm sorry, this is ancient literature. And the author is painting a picture of what happens to us. He had judged the Ninevites, Jonah had, as unworthy, and he hated them. And in that, he self-imposes his own exile from God. And as he does that, he just goes down. And we do the same thing oftentimes. As we continue to make small little decisions, we will go down and down and down. And who pays the price? Who's paying the price for this? The captain. Where's this guy, this traveler we brought on board? The captain came and said to him, that's Jonah, "What are you doing, you sleeper?" I'm going to use that with my kids. "What are you doing, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God." Interesting, because God, the author, opens the book of Jonah with God saying, "Arise, go and declare to the Ninevites, call out my message to them." And here you've got the captain down here going, "Arise, get up." You can imagine it's like, oh, this is what I started with. Somebody tell me to get up and do something. Call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. And they said to one another, Come, let us cast lots so that we may know on whose account the evil has come upon us. So they cast lots. And Jonah wins the lottery. Who's paying the price for Jonah's disobedience? Everyone on the boat. And in our culture, we live very much in a culture that, whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. As long as I'm not hurting anybody else, who cares what I'm doing? I mean, it doesn't really impact or affect anyone else. How many documentaries have you ever watched where you've got someone who is battling a drug addiction, and that eventually leads to a crime, or perhaps to care in a medical facility, or even to their death? Who's paying the price? Who is that impacting? Everyone who has to take care of them. Everyone who loves them. And we have a very narrow focus and view into our decisions. And as we begin to just slowly, with 1,000 small decisions, begin our descent down and away, we don't begin to consider who's paying the price for that, because we're literally asleep. We're deadened. We're numb to it. We can't even see what's happening around us. And we always have to keep in mind that what we do impacts other people. It's impacting them. These things that stack up over time. And so they play the lottery, they throw some dice, whatever form they did that, and Jonah wins the lottery. So then they said to him, the sailors, Tell us on whose account this evil, not this weather, but this evil. They know there's something about this. It's almost as if the storm has its own mind and consciousness that comes out after them. Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, sir? Good sir, what is your occupation? And where do you come from? And what is your country again? And what's your background? What race are you? Who's your people? And you might see that and think, do we have time? They're in the middle of a storm. Do we have time for these questions? But in the ancient culture, they're very logical questions. They're very logical. Here's why. The sailors are pagans. They worship gods with a S on the end. All kinds of gods. And there are gods of industry. Jonah, what do? There are gods of local towns. Where did you just come from? There are gods of countries, and there are gods of peoples, because sometimes peoples have been exiled into other countries, but they bring their own gods with them. Maybe if we can get a sense of the kind of gods you represent, then we can make a plea to them and save ourselves on this trip. And Jonah's answer is so revealing. I love his answer. And he says to them, I am a Hebrew. Ani Ivri. I'm a Hebrew. And I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. And you're supposed to laugh when you read that. Because Jonah, you should be thinking to yourself, no, you're not. You don't do this. You don't fear God. You don't worship God. You're fleeing from Him. You're running away. Come on. Really? Do His words contradict His actions? Very much so. I mean, we could sit around in a small study and say, can you believe this guy? Really? This is what he's going to do? This is the prophet of Yahweh that he's sending to Nineveh, to the Assyrians? I mean, let's think about it. If we just had to, let's open some beverages of your choice, and we're just having a little conversation as family. And as we begin to think about this, isn't this a little bit sometimes how God's people behave? Isn't this sometimes what God's people do? They'll say one thing, but then they do another. And isn't this occasionally what irritates people about God's people, oh, they're always saying they love, but then there they go judging and hating again. Don't want anything to do with that. And we might sit around in that group and you might think to yourself, I would never do that. I would never do what Jonah did. And then you would think about that a little bit in yourself and go, oh, wait a minute. Have I ever said something or said I believed something and behaved in a way that was opposite of that? And then you fell into the author's trap of seeing yourself in Jonah, seeing ourselves in Jonah in this very moment. But more than that, this is, again, I'm telling you, there's a little comedy in here. I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. The God who made the sea. So let me see if I get this straight. Jonah is running from the God who made the sea. He's running on a boat on the sea from the God who made the sea. Do you see the problem? Is this a problem? If you're the sailors and you hear that this man is running from his God on a boat, not just any boat, but on their boat. He's running from God on a boat on the sea from the God who made the sea. This is a problem. Like, he's not even thinking straight. And because this is the God who's made the land and sea, where do you go to run? Are you going to run on dry land? Are you going to run in the water? Where do you go? The earth, I'm sorry to say, you're kind of stuck on land or water unless you're in an airplane, but then you go all the way back to Genesis and find out that God made the sky. Where do you go to get away from the one who made all of this? And so the men were exceedingly afraid. And that's why they say, what is this you have done? You came on our boat, fleeing from the God that made the sea? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, Yahweh, because he had told them. But they didn't know who Yahweh was. Otherwise, they would have known this. Jonah would not have had to explain, this is the God who made everything, who all other gods report to. This is the God. And then they said to him, okay, what do we have to do to you to calm this storm down? Because in all systems, what is it? There's some punishment that you have to enact for disobedience, right? You do this with your children. They disobey, and you exercise some form of discipline. So what is it? Dove, son of faithfulness, what do we have to do to you in order to make this storm quiet down for us? And as they're having this conversation, the sea just grows more and more stormy. It's like you've got lightning coming from everywhere, big winds. I think of like Deadliest Catch, where you see they're out on these huge, massive waves, and it's getting even stronger, and they're coming from everywhere while they're trying to have this conversation. What do we do? Because your decision to flee from God, the maker of the seas, has put all of us in danger. Can't you see that? And they're a little ticked, and rightfully so. So he said to them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea. And then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Anybody want to take a guess at what the word hurl might mean in this context, given Jonah's directions? Throw me down. Throw me down. Just further down, away. And you might think, there are a couple of ways to read this. It could be that Jonah has had a legitimate change of heart. He's recognized his disobedience. He's recognized he's put everybody at risk. Now he sees it and he's like, I got to pay the price for my disobedience. It could also be that he's looking to run further away. Just kill me now. I just want to die. I want to go down to this place they believed in called Sheol. It's the underworld. It's the place under the earth. Just send me down there. If I have to die to avoid doing what God has asked me to do, then so be it. Those are kind of the two options we have with Jonah. His disobedience, his sinful, willful disobedience has led him to this moment. He'd rather die than obey God. And I will tell you, the author's intent, like what he's trying to communicate here, it's not necessarily clear. Did Jonah have a change of heart? Did he not? Not sure. I think it's left that way on purpose because some will read this or some will meditate on this story and go, oh, I need to go back. In which case it's fine. And some may read this story and say, if I continue on this path, then I'm going to be exiled down so far that it will be like I can't come back. And the author leaves that unclear, and that's okay. What do the pagans do? These evil pagans. Do they just throw him over the side right away? No, they row as hard as they can to try to get Jonah back to shore. They're trying to save his life. They hate this idea. They hate the idea of throwing him overboard. They rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more. And you can just see, it's like if it ever got turned into a non-VeggieTale movie. The sea's just growing and just getting crazy. Dove, son of faithfulness, has put everyone in danger. They're trying to save him. In fact, that's kind of interesting because Dove, son of faithfulness, Jonah, has in essence become their enemy at this point in time by making this decision, and they're trying to save their enemy. Exactly the opposite of what Jonah is trying to do. He doesn't want to try to save his enemies. Do you see the play? It's crazy. Ancient writers. Awesome. So what do you do when rowing's not work? Therefore, they called out to Yahweh. O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us the innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it has pleased you. It's interesting, we're this far into the book of Jonah, a prophet of Yahweh, Dove, son of faithfulness, and the first prayer to Yahweh, to God, comes from the pagan sailors. They're the first ones to call out to him. They're the first ones to have the conversation. It's the first prayer to Yahweh. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him, threw him down into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Confirmed, this is a divine action. You can see the clouds part. It's a sunny day. They probably get a helping wind, and they're on their way. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. They threw him down to the sea. And this statement we read, they made a sacrifice to Yahweh and made their vows. The way you would make a sacrifice in that day is you would build a fire and you would do a burnt offering. I'm pretty sure they're not doing that on their wooden ship. This is probably something they did when they got back to land. They made a commitment and a vow then to follow Yahweh. Isn't that interesting? In this one little story, the pagans turn and follow Yahweh. Jonah continues his descent, running away, the faithful one. It's a picture of, Jonah's a picture of people that say they know God and say they follow him, but they fail to show it. And so what happens? Here we go. Here's our verse. It's what Jonah's all known for. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And if the book ended here, it would be a tragedy. Because Jonah has died. This would become a story of tragedy. You and I know the end of the story, so you might go, okay, so he's in the fish and God's going to save him. But it literally, if it just stopped here, Jonah's over the side of the boat and he's in the belly of a fish, and do you survive in the belly of a fish? No. It'd be a tragedy. We would be looking and thinking, why didn't he just do what he'd been asked to do? Jonah continues his descent. If you kind of think of it going down, 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 down. Now what's he in? A fish that's going down even further. And every decision that he's making is continually moving him further and further and further away, out of consciousness, not aware, until he gets to a point where he's in, for lack of a better term, a pickle. That's what we would say, right? Looks like you got yourself into a pickle there, Jonah. How are you going to get out of that? Which is funny, because in 1,000 or 2,000 years from now, if somebody ever looked up that phrase, looks like you got yourself into a pickle, you could see how other people would be like, they must have had really big cucumbers that people could get in, and then you just got locked in there and couldn't get out. Man, how do you get... And then you'd have pickle churches that believe you should be in a pickle, right? Because other prophets of God were in pickles. Do you see how ridiculous these things can start to get? The author, the point is not, is Jonah alive in the fish or not? Let me ask you a quick question. Can your body have expired? Could it have reached the end of its usefulness and stopped working, and can you still be alive? It's not a trick question. Can you still be alive without your body? Yeah, that's what you and I are all planning on someday. You and I eventually will leave this body here, but we believe that we're going to exist somewhere else. So can Jonah's body have been completely and totally annihilated and Jonah still be alive? Yeah, absolutely he can. Because we're going to find that Jonah pens this pretty interesting prayer next week, and I don't know how he got electricity, a writing utensil, and a document to do that on in the fish. Jonah has died in the fish. There is nothing he can do now. The only way he's coming back at this point is through God stepping in and bringing him back. There is no way back now. For all intents and purposes, Jonah's done. And who sends the fish? God sends the fish. Everything in this story so far obeys God. There is no way to get away from any of this. The fish is an instrument of death, but it does become a vehicle of God's grace. And it's going to wake Jonah from his disobedience and his slumber, don't you think? I think so. So what now? You're in a fish, right? You're in a fish. Oftentimes, I can do a message that I can give you sort of the to-do. Well, here's some things to consider. And then sometimes you get into sections like this where the text is talking about the character of God and the character of humans. And the goal of the author is for us to see the character of God, that he will relentlessly pursue us, and that we have this tendency to run and run and run through a series of really unwise decisions because we just don't want to get on board with the plan. This is I've really messed up and God has to rescue me type of a message. And it's interesting because this applies to us as Christians. I like Jonah for this reason. Jesus specifically refers to Jonah as a sign that Jesus, would be in the grave 3 days and then he would come back. Just like Jonah was in the belly of a fish for 3 days and then he came back. We're going to see that. Jesus uses this as an example of this is as far as you have to go away. You can be this far away where there's nothing you can do, and there is a way to rescue you from that moment. And that's good news for people who tend to be runners. That's really good news for those of us who have this tendency to run. And I'll just share this one with you if you want to look it up later. There's also a scene in the Gospels where Jesus is in a boat. And do you know what he's doing in the boat? He's sleeping. It's interesting. And what's happening while he's sleeping? There's this raging storm. These authors, they know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. The story is if you get swallowed because of your decisions, that Jesus can bring you back from that brink. He can rescue you out of that moment, but it requires a decision of obedience to say, okay, I give. I'm going to go your way and do what you've asked me to do. And that's really what this is about. God's desire to chase you into the stomachs of fish, even when you think that you have gone so far that you can't be reached. And I don't know about you, that's good news. That's pretty cool, that we serve a God that can do that and make that happen for us. And so hopefully as you go through this week, you can let this story marinate a little bit in your brain. Maybe see yourself in Jonah and see God's grace in your life a bit. And we can make some decisions to follow what God has asked us to do rather than run away.